The 2024 election, presidential election officially in full swing. Candidates in both parties campaigning, raising money ahead of the primaries next year. So naturally, the most charismatic president in U.S. history has reappeared. Enter Barack Obama. Now, the former president has emerged from his multi-million-dollar estate. He's got many of them, but I'm talking about the one in Martha's Vineyard, to lecture the American people on the issue of race in an interview today that dropped on CNN. Obama can't help himself. If you notice, he doesn't spend a lot of time praising pal Joe Biden, who has got his old job. We can only wonder why that is. Joe and Barack used to be really good friends. I think they gave each other friendship bracelets. Remember when Joe Biden tweeted that photo of the bracelet? Doesn't Obama think Joe is a good president? Shouldn't he get another bracelet to cite that new advantage with the new job? Doesn't seem to be happening. Instead, Obama used the CNN interview to attack Republicans, specifically not Donald Trump, but Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. The fact that Tim Scott has an optimistic view of race relations in America seems to have the former president very upset.
I'm not being cynical about Tim Scott individually. I am maybe suggesting that the rhetoric of can't we all get along and the quotes you made about, from my speech in 2004 about there's a United States of America, that has to be undergirded with an honest accounting of our past and our present. And so if a Republican who may even be sincere in saying, I want us all to live together, doesn't have a plan for how do we address crippling generational poverty that is a consequence of hundreds of years of racism in the society, and we need to do something about that.
I love that line, maybe even sincerely wants us all to get along. But let's move ahead. It doesn't matter that President Obama, that Tim Scott overcame extreme poverty in South Carolina to achieve what he achieved. I had a chance to walk through the overgrown field where his house was that he grew up in. It was a one-bedroom shack. It stood there where his brother, his mother, and his grandparents lived together. It was razed instead of being rebuilt. Look around. They didn't just let the whole neighborhood rot away. That's how bad it was. But it inspired him. From going to fast food worker to college kid to business success, U.S. Congress, now the U.S. Senate, and next perhaps the White House. This is a great story. Why doesn't President Obama embrace it? Tim Scott does not think America is a fundamentally racist, evil nation. It seems to bother him. Obama wants all minorities to believe that, and he's been preaching that message for several years. I can't tell you how disappointing it is. He even after he left office. I remember when he spoke at John Lewis's funeral. Here's the gist of his message.
He knew from his own life that progress is fragile, that we have to be vigilant against the darker currents of this country's history, of our own history, with their whirlpools of violence and hatred and despair that can always rise again. Bull Connor may be gone, but today we witness with our own eyes police officers kneeling on the necks of black Americans.
As if it happens every day, right? In other words, President Obama believes America's a terrible, racist country, never good, hates black people. There's been no progress. He believes the country John Lewis was born in is unchanged when he passed away. And that, to me, is sad. Now, when you hear President Obama speak, it's hard to believe he was actually ever president. No one had more power than Barack Obama when he took office. He had the power to improve race relations in a country to show that anything is possible. Just look at his biography. But too often, his success was not conveyed. Cynicism oozed out on almost every inflection point when he was in power. He seemed to make things worse.
My main message is to the parents of Trayvon Martin. If I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. The fact is, in too many parts of this country, a deep distrust exists between law enforcement and communities of color. Some of this is the result of the legacy of racial discrimination in this country.
All right, so intentional or not, President Obama actually did the exact opposite. He fanned the flames of racial divide in this nation. That's not our opinion, it's a fact. during Obama's last year in office. There was a poll done. A CNN actually did it. So a majority of Americans, 54%, believe race relations worsened under President Obama. This is a poll, and that included 40% of the black population. And the numbers of Americans who believe the criminal justice system treated black and whites equally actually decreased 6 points last year. Now, a New York Times poll that same year had similar results. Nearly 70% of Americans said race relations was generally bad, which at the time was the highest number since 1992, right when the Rodney King riots happened in Los Angeles. So it's not an exaggeration to say that Obama historically bad on the issue of race, the very issue he promised to help heal if elected president. And he was elected twice. Everything Obama says about race now is far different when we first heard of him. Senator Obama, first running for office, he was trying to win your vote. Barack Obama sang a different tune.
Now, throughout the first year of this campaign, against all predictions to the contrary, we saw how hungry the American people were for this message of unity. Despite the temptation to view my candidacy through a purely racial lens, we won commanding victories in states with some of the whitest populations in the country. In South Carolina, where the Confederate flag still flies, we built a powerful coalition of African Americans and white Americans.
Remember that, President Obama, when he was Senator Obama, and then he won by even a wider margin for re-election? He believed in unity, bringing everybody together, blacks and whites. Only when his predecessor, Donald Trump, took over did President Obama seem to change his mind about race relations in America. And ironically, Trump is the one person who can argue that he did a better job bridging the gap between blacks and whites, at least economically, under Trump. Black unemployment reached a record low of 5.2%. The black labor force participation level hit a record high in 2008. Now, the recession, since the 2008 recession, something President Obama could not achieve even with 8 years in office. Poverty rate for black Americans also hit record lows, with 1 million black Americans lifting themselves from poverty during Trump's presidency. These are the numbers. That's not an opinion. You're not allowed to point that out in the media or even argue that America is a great country for all Americans. How about the most successful multicultural country in the history of the world? Now, if you're a black Republican, you're in trouble. Hopefully that one day will change. Horace Cooper is a senior fellow with the National Center for Public Policy and joins us now. Horace, were you surprised President Obama used this moment to go after Senator Tim Scott 2 weeks after declaring his candidacy? Why not embrace it?
Well, absolutely. I guess if I had the record that he had for black Americans, I would actually stay away from conversations about public policy officials and black America. He has the odious record of a 16.8% unemployment rate for black Americans. Now, he had a very, very toxic policy that he used. First, you have to destroy employment among all Americans, and then you get it worse for black Americans. More black Americans had their cars repossessed, had their homes foreclosed on during his presidency. You have to go all the way back to the Great Depression to find a time when black Americans were hurt as bad as they have been under Barack Obama's policy. It's a stark contrast with Donald Trump.
So he had a challenge for Tim Scott in the conversation with David Axelrod. He said, you have to have a plan for black Americans if you're going to run. I don't care if you're a Republican or not. He just assumes that he's sincerely trying to run. Number one, I would run the way Barack Obama ran on his biography. That's what he ran on. His book was a bestseller because it was a wonderful success story, and only in America story. But Tim Scott does have a plan. And one thing he worked with President Trump on was opportunity zones. He said, hey, you're going to do tax reform, I'll help you. But I want opportunity zones. And what it did is it incentivized the private sector to finance the rebuilding of communities, but not to price black Americans out or the working class out. It's to make their neighborhoods better. It was unbelievably successful, and it's still got great potential. That's more than just an idea. That's a plan.
Oh, absolutely. A rising tide lifts all boats, and under the Obama years, Americans of color, as well as the rest of the country, but Americans of color in particular, lost a lot of ground. Under the Trump years, when we decided to allow opportunity, instead of claiming you didn't build that, we said the door's open, come on in, and you get a shot at it. This former president shouldn't of all things, shouldn't be talking about black America and policy with regard to the really, really odious record that he set. And last thing I'll say is, he's the reason that he's the only president who's ever been reelected since Roosevelt who got fewer percentage of black votes the second time that he ran than the first time. This wasn't true of Clinton. This wasn't true of Bush. Even in losing, Donald Trump got a higher percentage of black votes the second time.
It just shouldn't be this tough to be African American, be a Republican, and want to be president. I don't think you should be forced to actually qualify yourself to the black community. Look at his story and decide if you like that story and you want him at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That's it. And he's an extremely bright guy. By the way, when I talked about those opportunity zones, $100 billion he got private business and banks to give to rebuild many black and minority and working class communities. Thanks so much, Horace. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.